Before we dive in, this week's episode is brought to you by my free cheat sheet, 30 Top Tips to Find Time to Write. In this guide, I give you 30 ways that you can find time to write in the small gaps that appear between the various errands and tasks and responsibilities that you have in your day-to-day life. Now, you might be thinking that you don't have any time to spare, but I can guarantee these top tips will give you writing time you didn't think you had. If you thought writing always involved a pen and paper or a keyboard, think again. If you thought you needed at least an hour at a time to write your manuscript, I help you reframe that. You won't be disappointed. Get your free copy of 30 Top Tips to Find Time to Write by going to emmadesi.com/30 top tips. Okay, let's dive in to today's episode.
Michele Tracy Berger is a professor, a writer, a creativity coach and a pug lover. Her main love is writing speculative fiction, though she is also known to write poetry and creative non-fiction too. Her short stories, poetry and creative non-fiction have appeared or are forthcoming in 100 Word Story, Apex Magazine, Glint Literary Journal, The Wild Word, Thing Magazine, Blood and Bourbon, FIYAH, a magazine of black speculative fiction, Flying South, Oracle Fine Arts Review, Carolina Woman, Ms., The Feminist Wire, Western North Carolina Woman, and various zines and anthologies. She is widely published. She is the 2019 winner of the Carl Brandon Kindred Award from the Carl Brandon Society for her story Doll's Seed, published in FIYAH, Magazine of Black Speculative Fiction. In 2020, her science fiction novella, Renew You, about a mysterious virus transmitted through a hair care product billed as a natural hair relaxer, was published by Falstaff Books. Much of her work explores psychological horror, especially through the issues of race and gender. She is currently a trustee on the board of the North Carolina Writers Network and president-elect of the North Carolina Literary and Historical Association. So today we are talking not about race or gender, but in fact money. A big emotive subject for a lot of people, particularly creatives and writers. All of us, no matter what we do, we all have emotions around money, opinions about money, beliefs that we've grown up with about money and how our family responds to money and thinks about money. And when we become business owners, as we do when we become published writers, this is something that we do need to navigate, is how we view money and how we view earning a living through our writing. And as you'll discover from our conversation today, it can take you to some deep inner places, but it also has the power, when you work on your money mindset, it has the power to really transform many other areas of your life and not just the money. So I hope you'll listen to this. It's a really interesting conversation we have, and I love Michele's take on things, and she's a very practical person, and I love how she articulates her views around money and how we approach money. So enough from me, let's delve in. Well, Michele, it's lovely to have you on this show. Thank you so much for joining me today.
I'm super happy to be here, Emma. This is so great. I get to come back the second time and talk about something near and dear to my heart and near and dear to your heart.
Yes, 100%. I'm all about this at the moment. I'm loving this topic that we've got today. But I'd love it if you would just give us a little feel for you and your writing and how you got to where you are.
Sure. So I write creative nonfiction, poetry, but my true love is speculative fiction. And I would say that I have been a professionally tracking writer for the last decade, after a decade before that of trying to become a writer. And a little bit about my money journey. So I was, one of the things that kind of really became clear to me was when I was in a money workshop with a woman named Glenda Bridgeforth, and she wrote a book called Girl, Get Your Money Straight, which was a holistic financial approach, particularly for African American women. And so I was in a workshop with her, and I was making the most money I had ever made at the time. So this is in 2000, and I was a postdoc at Berkeley. And I was in this workshop, and it was in the Bay Area, primarily women of color, but not exclusively. And she asked a question. She said, how many people make six figures? So people raise their hand. How many people have a savings account? People raise their hand. How many people don't know how they're going to pay their bills? People raise their hand. And so as I'm looking around, Emma, I'm projecting on like, oh, the women who are making six figures, they must not have any problems, or, sort of that kind of thing. And then she broke us into groups, and she asked us to do an exercise and write it was an open prompt called Dear Money. And we were to write out all sorts of things about what we did in terms of thinking about money. And then the second half of that prompt was money answered us. So we had to kind of imagine money responding to us. And then in the small groups, the revelation came was the women who had, from my perspective, trust funds and, six-figure incomes, had some of the same money challenges that at the time myself and other women who did not have that. And so that really led me on a journey to dig more deeply into this concept of money and self-worth. And I was a client of Glinda's for many years. And then I was one of her holistic financial coaches, because when she went on Oprah, that changed her life, and she needed more people to do that. But so it was a long journey, and but that really kind of taught me that this concept of that inner and outer don't always match, right, in terms of incomes and things like that.
Yeah, I have the same thing when I look at people that I follow or women that I admire, and I see that they are earning at least six figures. Some of them are earning seven figures or more. And I think, gosh, they've got it all figured out. They know exactly what's going on. I can't wait till I get to be like them, and I have no more money issues whatsoever. But I think even, I'm a long way off from that, but even as my business grows and I do start to earn more than I did last year, there's still the same fears, there's still the same concerns, and still the same excitement as well. Is a positive thing, but it just shows that there's always something new to learn. There's something new to kind of uncover about ourselves and our own relationship with money.
Absolutely.
And it's such an emotive subject, isn't it? Money. It's very personal. People can get very upset about talking about it. And as creatives and writers, I've noticed that there is quite more than a usual reluctance to talk about it. Almost like if you're a writer, if you're an artist or a creative, you shouldn't be talking about money. You shouldn't even be thinking about money. You should be doing it just for the love of it. And it's kind of almost a dirty word. And I was thinking, I wonder why that is. Why do you think we creatives have this sort of fear of it or embarrassment around it?
Yeah, absolutely. So one, I just want to go back, echo that, we always think someone else is doing it better in terms of money. And we always think someone else's inner money game is so much stronger than ours, right? So that's just something we project. But you hit the nail on the head in that, I think that most of us have not had the time or space to do the work around creativity and commerce and what we really believe. So a lot of times we've absorbed, I think, negative societal beliefs about that relationship. Sometimes that comes from culture. Sometimes that comes from our family of origin. Quite honestly, sometimes some of us aren't really financially literate. And so there's a lot of learning that we have to do in our game. And so it's just easy, I think, to believe this idea generally that I think artists and creative people are pushing back on, but this larger idea that, if you're doing something related to creativity, you're just bound to not have the resources that you need. You're bound to not be seen. And then I think if you're also coming from a community that has not traditionally seen itself in that creative way, or, have a lot of role models, that can also influence our thinking. But I think a lot of it is we just have sort of unexamined beliefs, and it takes a while to really think through what does that mean, and also to find models, like you were saying, in terms of just seeing particularly indie authors and other writers and creatives who are doing quite well, and then also to say, well, what is for, that's great for them, but then does that mean that I have to do the same thing, right? So then we get into like, what's the right path for us right? Because not everyone needs to or wants to want to do six figures, but that's kind of a nice benchmark, I think. So looking at that, but I really think we have to go back to what did we learn as young people? What did we learn as emerging artists around craft and commerce?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, actually, you've just made me realize as well that often when we say to family, like I wanted to be, I was an actor for a while, and I would say, I want to be an actor, but it's the same. I hear from other people who say I want to be a writer. Okay, but get a degree first, get a proper job first, and then you can do that for fun, or you can do that as a hobby. So it's almost like we're being set from a very, very early age that being a creative person is not valid in some way, and you can't earn a living or support yourself doing that. So it does suggest, that really right at the beginning we need to change that.
Absolutely. And I'm sure you've done this kind of work with creative people. One, it's sort of giving yourself permission to be creative and to pursue a creative life, right? So there's that piece. And then also, if we were in families of origin that we got those messages, we have to deal with that friction. And then we just have to deal with the fact of, something we were talking about right before the podcast. I mean, money feels like a mysterious force, right? Like it's not rational to some degree, yet we try to apply rational logic to it. So just being human, and I think dealing with what does money represent, what does abundance represent, what does prosperity represent, and what are our inner beliefs and how do they correspond? So some people go the way of like, I'm not going to think at all about money. Like that whole world is not important to me. And I'm just about the love of arts and the love of creating. Well, that's fine. You can structure your life that way. However, there's an opportunity, I think, to really think about and to play with those money beliefs and abundance beliefs to say, it could be different, right? And all money beliefs and practices we have learned, so we can unlearn them and adopt new ones if we need to.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's a learned behavior or a learned attitude towards cash. Cold, and actually,
Yes.
It's making me think, the words that we use about money: cold hard cash, rich people are greedy, or you have to have done something wrong to become rich. These can all feed into the fears that we have around it.
Yes, we never say, well, just on that point, we never say, we say filthy rich, but then we never say, oh, ethically rich, or, cool and rich, or, no, it's true. Like looking at just our language around that. And I think, I know now more in the writing community, in the arts community, we are now talking about, what people make, publishing deals, what people make in terms of, independent, being an independent author. So there's a little bit more transparency than I think when you and I were growing up and starting, like in terms of what artists and writers talk about. So now there's a little bit, I think, less of a stigma and a taboo to talk about money. But we have to be, I think, in a really grounded place when we do that, because really our self-worth is not, at least in my opinion, it does not correspond always to these outer numbers, but thinking about how do we open ourselves to more abundance, just more broadly, and prosperity and generosity. And that affects also how we interact with the creative community as well.
Mm-hmm. So taking that word, abundance, I'm just kind of wondering about your experience with Glinda Bridgeforth, is it?
Mm-hmm.
So when you were working with clients there, I mean, I'm guessing that abundance showed itself in many different ways, although you're doing financial coaching, but I'm guessing for everybody, it wasn't about getting six figures or seven figures. I wonder if you could remember kind of back to those days and any examples you might have of what abundance might look for different people.
Yeah, absolutely. So it's interesting. We never talked about budgets. We talked about a spending plan. So in terms of that language, so a lot of it was getting people stable, right? So having them go through Glinda's book, or, if we're watching the shows from Oprah, so kind of going through a process. And we emphasize that the sense of your money is connected to all other areas of your life. So we wanted to help people get healthy and thoughtful about every way that they were showing up in the world. So I would work with people around a spending plan, but we would have conversations about what does abundance look like to you? What does it feel like to you? So does it mean that, once a week you can buy your, favorite $15 bubble bath, right? And if that's the case, then let's really make sure that your spending plan connects to the things that are going to make you feel very fulfilled. Now, I will say, people came to us at different levels of stress, right? In terms of people who, particularly mostly women, but not exclusively, women who were at a certain stage in their life and realized they really hadn't prepared financially, and they were with someone, a partner or spouse, who really kept them in the dark around their finances. So it was also about kind of, how do you empower people to take control more of their money. And then I also remember one client I had who, she said, well, I only open up my bills by the color coded as they come in. I said, well, what do you mean? And she said, well, when they get to red, when they get to blue or red, and there's all caps on the outside, I know I need to open. I was like, okay, let's pause here. Okay, let's kind of do some deep work about being responsible and feeling like, okay, so this has happened. So now let's think through, how do we kind of move out of that crisis mode into more kind of stable plan? So, so we looked at abundance, we looked at prosperity. We also did a lot of work of like, what's your money tree history? Like, what's your family history? Who was the person who supported you? Who was the person that you kind of got these ideas about your own sense of self-worth? And one of the things I'll just say that Glinda often emphasized, particularly for African-American women of color, this idea of like, oh, I could look good on the outside, but I could have the status things, the handbag, the nice coat, whatever, but then be completely full of shame and lack of knowing inside. But as long as I look good on the outside, it's fine, right? So we also sort of dealt with that, and looking at kind of when people feel shamed or haven't had the same kind of access, we then overvalue what money can do, right? So it's also trying to kind of have that more balanced relationship.
Yeah. Oh, that's really interesting. And I haven't thought about it in that way, the overvaluing what money can do for you. And just because it looks good on the inside doesn't mean it's corresponding on so it looks good on the outside doesn't mean it's corresponding on the inside. And what you were saying there about family, the family tree of money, that's reminded me of something I learned recently, which I hadn't given any thought to before. Didn't know this existed, but the idea that sort of subconsciously or unconsciously, our families have this kind of upper earning limit.
Oh yes. Let's talk about it.
Which first of all, when I heard this, I kind of scoffed it a bit, and I thought, well, that can't be right, because in my family we never talked about money, in any real way. So how could I possibly have an upper earning limit when I don't know, when it's never been discussed? But then when I went back and chatted about it with my mum, sure enough, there had been this, I've never earned more than my parents. And I think about my husband and what he earns, and I think, no, I don't think he's ever earned any more than his father. That fascinated me, especially because it's so unconscious. We're not aware of it. I wonder if you could chat to us a little bit more about that.
Oh my goodness, you hit the nail on the head. That the ways in which we might say to ourselves, like, for you, Emma, like, okay, well, I'm this amazing coach, I'm a writer, and I am open to prosperity, right? Like, I, want to serve people, right? So just thinking about that, but then that the unconscious belief of like, oh, maybe we haven't seen it modeled in our family of origin, but also, what does that mean? It's also like, I feel like it gets to be in some ways very tribal, very communal. Like, I don't want to outshine whomever, right? So there's that piece of it. So, I know we're going to talk a little bit about Denise Duffield Thomas's work, but Gay Hendricks also in The Big Leap talks about the upper limit problem. So it can be helpful then to have those conversations, to think about where did we take on, I like to think of unconscious contracts. Right. So for example, for me, I'm a professor by training and profession. And in academe, there is, you're supposed to be there just for the work, like, particularly if you work at a public university, public college. So this idea of being visible and earning is, it's in some ways it breaks the larger pattern of other people, right? And so the idea of also being flashy or things like that. So in my family, my mother talked quite a bit about money. She actually was a very independent working woman, and then unfortunately got involved with my stepfather, who was very abusive, isolated her. And so by the time she went back into the workplace, things had changed dramatically. And so there was a lot of conversation about that. But one of the things I learned from her was like, money burns a hole in your pocket. So when you have it, you go out and spend it. You go to the best restaurants. We live in New York City. You take taxis, you do all of those things. You may not worry about the future as much. But then with my godmother, who was very close to, she would like, now I respect this now, but when I was growing up, I didn't understand every like bit of wrapping paper. She'd rewrap it, like organize it, every bit of like aluminum foil. But she was a very stable person. So her thing was like, you save and save and save, and you're not flashy with what you have. So she had this, so that was, in some ways that's wonderful. Like, of course, saving, but this idea of like anything that was too flashy or outward was seen as bad. So, I think that becomes also different levels of that whole upper limit. But yeah, trying to sort of think about, where those unconscious things for some people, it's like, oh, I don't want to earn more than my mentor. Mm-hmm. Right. Because that's kind of that sense of, not outshining someone else. So it could be in our family of origin, but it could also be in terms of our mentor or even our profession. Mm-hmm. Right.
Because you don't want to seem to be, it's almost like a sort of, I respect you, therefore I'm not going to kind of do better than you. I'm going to know my place and stay where I should be.
And what will people think? And I think for a lot of women, like, oh, what will people think of me if I'm making this kind of money and being visible? So that's the other piece, that we can push money away or push abundance away, because we also have that sense of, I'm going to be, are people, what are people going to think about me? Are people going to think I'm a bad person, or, that I'm not responsible? So those can, and they're not something that's conscious until we do that inner work. Yeah. So I'm sure. So, can you say a little bit more about your conversation with your mom? Because that must have been really juicy. Of like, was she like, of course, make all the money that you can?
Well, it was interesting because I was asking her about it, and for her growing up, never discussed money at all. And then when I was growing up, that was also never discussed. And I think because my parents came from very different families, my mum was, I would say, upper middle class, so had a very affluent upbringing. My father is immigrant, so he had a very impoverished upbringing. And so they kind of had this natural mismatch about how they viewed money, how abundant they felt, the ease with which money kind of would come and go. So that was very different. And so I think for that reason, because they viewed it differently, they never really talked about it. So it was never talked to us kids about how you approach money, see money, view money, your relationship with money, and how you look after it. Yes. So when I was chatting to her about it, though, it turned out that yes, I probably earn a little bit more than her now, but have never really, especially when I was in the corporate world, never earned more than her. But interestingly, what she told me, so she works in HR, she was the head of department, she's about to retire. A new younger man is coming in, and he said, well, I'm not going to do the job for anything less than 3 times the amount that she was being paid. And he got that salary that he wanted. And my mum was like, oh, I would never think to ask for that amount of money. I would never think to ask for an increase like that. And I think that too, making generalizations, of course, about women and how they see their worth and their value within the workplace and the money that they earn. Whereas kudos to this guy, he knows his value, and he's not afraid to say, this is what I think I'm worth. It's up to you whether you pay me that or not. But again, I think I just thought it all fitted in really nicely about how not nicely, but it all made sense about how women view themselves in the workplace, what we value and what we're prepared to ask for, and then our relationship with money as well, and how we talk about it. So it was really interesting.
That's like could be a just that piece. We could have a whole separate show on that, but like that's so powerful. And I think some of the main wonderful folks who are driving this larger conversation in the creative community happen to be women. You know, Leonie Dawson, who's Australian entrepreneur, who was the mentor of Denise Duffield Thomas. Rachel Rogers, her new book on We Should All Be Millionaires, which I highly recommend. She's an African-American woman who's a lawyer. So, you know, the real gendered implications of often not being trained to feel comfortable to negotiate, to really ask, to understand our own value, and to be able to ask for that, whether you know, the institution or position is going to give us that, but being able to be comfortable with that, that's, I think, a huge area of growth for all of us. And then the other piece that you mentioned is this idea of ease. So I always used to say, abundance, you know, in terms of all the things that I've ever taught in my life, abundance and prosperity work is some of the most difficult work to teach, because people, you know, as we've been talking about, have kind of entrenched beliefs about certain things. But this idea of ease and effort and income and money, to try to have people decouple or play with those things, because most of us got this idea of, you know, hard work, you know, if you work hard, then you should be rewarded, right? And as opposed to, you know, that can lead people down some very difficult roads in some ways, right? But then the sense of like, well, am I not worthy if things come easy to me? So a lot of times we, you know, you probably see this in terms of coaching, in terms of supporting people where they might have real talents, but it feels too easy for them around certain things. And so then they block it, as opposed to saying, no, that could be a source of revenue or a way to think about money coming to you. But we doubt that because it seems quote unquote easy and without effort. So I know there's a lot of work around trying to Denise Duffield Thomas's, her Chillpreneur book, and also the Money Bootcamp that you and I are in, really tries to get people to think about that.
Just because it's fun and enjoyable doesn't mean it's not of value. Yeah.
Yes. And hopefully, I mean, I think as we now live in a culture where, you know, if you look at, you know, creators are creating things for people online, you know, there's just, from when we were growing up, there's just a lot more, you know, kind of experimentation. Like there are people who like watching gamers, you know, play video games and talk about it, right? And they can make millions of dollars, you know, like teenagers, which is great, right? So I think we're entering into a new kind of commercial space, marketplace, where people can have more access to thinking about those kinds of things that are playful, like that money and abundance, prosperity can be playful and not like, you know, so tight and hardened and challenging.
So wonderful stuff we've been chatting about here, really sort of hitting on a few parts of where our money beliefs lie and how they can be holding us back, or if we don't have these, you know, how they can be helping us kind of move forward. So thinking about how we can bring that back to the writing space. How do you think these money beliefs can impact writers who are coming up and feeling like, I want to be a writer, or I want a career as a writer, but how can we help writers kind of maybe start rethinking how they view a creative life financially?
So I think, you know, this, depending on where people are in their life phase. So it will look different if you are retired or semi-retired versus if you're in your 20s. So, I mean, I think the first piece is really understanding it's going to be a journey, right? And being able to embrace it, your craft and your commitment to being a good literary citizen is really what's going to take you the furthest, because actually building relationships, so separate from the craft and doing the work, the relationships you build in a writing community are a type of abundance and prosperity, and they lead you to opportunity. So a lot of times I think it's important for writers to really kind of cultivate that in a, in a sustainable way, but when they're starting out. And then it's to say, well, what are my models? So for me, I happen to have I happen to be in a profession where I get the summers off, so to speak. Technically, they're not off because you're supposed to be doing research, but I have kind of a window to say, okay, I can sort of structure my writing there. So it's also looking at what are the models that are possible for you in terms of thinking about how to support your writing those first couple of years. And not everyone needs to quit their day job, right? Like, so it's also just thinking about what are the components of a creative life? And then what models do I see out there, right? So we all might aspire to what some people have called like the literary lottery, right? Where you send your novel out or you send your memoir out and it gets plucked out of the slush pile and then you get a contract. That typically doesn't happen for traditional authors, right? Or on the indie side, you publish, the first thing and, you are a 6-figure author. Like that doesn't typically happen. Not that it can't ever happen. It doesn't typically happen. So it's also like, well, what are the ways in which we can look at what your money beliefs are while you're doing the work of getting your manuscripts finished. So I think they go hand in hand, but I think having some models, there's a wonderful book called creating, I think it's creating it's by Carol Lloyd, and it's really about, I'm blanking a little bit on the title because it's an older title, but it's looking at what models are out there for creative life. And she interviews composers and dancers and writers and having them talk about the ways in which they've approached a creative life. So I think sort of starting that piece is important. And then if you're a little bit further along, and this is something that Denise Duffield Thomas, I think, has helped a lot of people with, is also thinking if you're a little bit further along, let's say you have things published, maybe you have an author service practice as well, like so many people do, or some other gig on the side, then how can you create passive income? Just a little money stream that's coming in that will be a buffer over time, right? So there could be a lot of ways, depending on where you are in your life path, to think about this. What are the next steps? But I think the first piece is, really honing your craft, building a community, and then working on, okay, what are the models out there that I can start to follow?
Mm-hmm. That's a wonderful suggestion. I'll find that book, Carol Lloyd's book, and I'll link to that for people, so that, because we all need examples, don't we, of what's possible, and either we can follow that example or we can sort of alter it slightly to fit our own individual circumstances. But I like too that you point out that not every writer needs to give up their day job, and there are many people who love their day job but maybe just cut it down to part-time so that it allows enough time to do the paid work and also to do the creative work as well.
Yes. And I think in Scratch too, I was going to say, we were talking about a little bit this before the podcast. Scratch is a book edited by Manjulu Martin, and the title is Writer's Money and the Art of Making a Living. And that's a wonderful book. It's a collection of essays. And I will say it defaults more to traditionally published writers. However, what you see there, you see this wide variation of people who've done ghostwriting, people who've done technical writing, people who are, writing for magazines, people who have written novels, but the novels weren't something they could live on. So I think also seeing that broader pattern of, for writers at least, what are the different ways in which people kind of negotiate the commerce part of it? And Jessica, I think the way you say her last name is Weiner. Jessica Weiner, who's a very famous commercial writer, she has a really powerful essay in that piece, in the book, talking about this trade-off she feels like she made, where she's a very successful commercial writer and doesn't get the respect from the literary establishment, even though she's super wealthy and super rich. And she talks about her own experience. Her dad was in bankruptcy, and she talks about that shame. And for her, she was like, I know I love to write. and I'm going to figure out a way to do this and be rich. And so anyway, so it's a really helpful collection, I think, just to get people thinking about some of the things that we've been chatting about.
Mm-hmm. Good suggestion there. Yeah. I'm just going to change tack slightly a little bit, and just sort of thinking about, writers who are fearful about investing in themselves. I spoke to a writer recently called Imogen Clark, who's sold millions of ebooks. She's e-first author, and she's not going to be a household name, but she's sold a lot of books and she makes a very good living. And one of the things that she said in the interview was how important it was that for her, and what she would recommend for other people, is to invest in themselves and in their writing. And I subsequently got an email from somebody in response to that, saying, well, that was a really risky thing for her to do, because she had no guarantee that she would be successful and could, essentially was saying, get a return on her investment. And that kind of got me thinking and jarred with me slightly. And I guess because it's not the way that I view life. I don't view my writing that way, as I see it as something I want to get better at, and so I do invest in it. But I wondered what your thoughts were on that.
Yeah, that's such a great question.
You on the spot there.
Yeah, and I love that you have your listeners and folks write into you and are all like, tell me more about this. So one way to think about that is, are we they're just, in terms of our larger personality, right? There are going to be people who are a little bit more risk tolerant and or risk adverse. So that's just kind of goes without saying. And I think that also people who, we've known writers who are like, I have 6 months of savings and I'm ready to be a full-time author. And so they go for it, they leap. And some of those people are, they 2 years later, they're really happy. It may be a little bit of a financial struggle, but they gain ground over time. And then other people were like, no, I'm going back to the day job. So I think that's important. But I would say that person who wrote you could also look at and say, okay, are there places in my life that I don't even think about investing, right? That also help other people. Maybe it helps the family, maybe it's in other parts of one's life, but then am I sacrificing, am I doing that, but then kind of skimping on what I say is my heart's desire? Because money follows our attention, right? Money likes to have clear places and clear channels. So it is my belief, at least, that when we align ourselves with our thoughts, words, and deeds, right, that creates, we might say, kind of an energetic or just a kind of a clear pathway for what we want in the world, right? So I would say it is important to invest in our writing self. And that can look a lot of different ways for people. So it doesn't mean that you do it, irrationally or whatever. But I would ask that person, okay, are there places that they really are overinvested in other aspects of their lives, and kind of treating their writing in this, more minimized way? And can you just do a little bit, one of the things that Denise Duffield Thomas talks about too is the incremental upgrade. So can you do a little incremental upgrade that signals to you and your subconscious and to the larger universe, oh, I'm ready to go to the next level, right? And it could just be like, oh, well, I'm going to download that program, or I'm going to, in 3 months, I'm going to get that new computer because I'm tired of the L key that is always falling off when I type, right? So are there little incremental upgrades that then you can feel comfortable over time taking a little bit bigger risk, right?
Risk management in a way. Yeah. I love the incremental upgrade.
Yeah. I don't know if that fully answers the question, but yeah, I would say trying to kind of manage that and moving more toward making our writing self visible, affirmed, and seen,
Yeah.
and doing some of that through the money piece.
No, it does. I think it does answer the question, or at least part of it, because then you're not only signaling to other people, but you're signaling to yourself as well that I take this seriously, that my writing is important to me and valuable to me. And even if I never make a financial return on it, I know that I've made an emotional investment as much as anything, an energetic investment. And it might not come back to me financially, but it's going to come back to me in self-esteem, in the joy of learning, in the creativity that comes with it,
confidence. Yes, I talk a lot about, I do a lot of work around having people submit their writing, in the traditionally published world, but also a lot of times, even if you're indie published, you may want to submit to an anthology or something like that. So it takes confidence, right, to get through that process and then get through the rejection. And so all of those little pieces that you talked about give us more energy, standing in our own selves around, this is the path that I want to take.
Yeah, that's self-validation.
Yes, absolutely.
So for those of people who are listening and maybe kind of recognize some of what we've talked about in their own behavior and feelings and views on money, and their writing, do you have any thoughts about how they can start to kind of work on those or start addressing those? I know we mentioned Denise Duffield Thomas's Money Bootcamp, which I think we would both really recommend to anybody who wants to kind of improve their relationship with money. Sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead, sorry.
Is there any other resources that you think would be useful to people?
Well, and so we should say we don't have an affiliate link or anything for Denise Duffield Thomas. We just really love her work. And I read Chillpreneur, which was great, and some of her other books before jumping into Money Bootcamp last year. And I would say one exercise just to do on their own is to write a letter to, start at the beginning and say, "Dear Money," and just write all of whatever comes out. And then have, this obviously in your imagination, have money respond to you. That exercise alone could just reveal some thoughts, ideas, frustrations, anger, rage, joy, all of that. And then I would recommend, I love the book Prosperity for Writers by Honoré Corder. Okay, and that's a short book, wonderful, wonderful book. Just basically about getting writers to expand their sense of prosperity. And she interviewed highly successful writers, talked about their habits, but also kind of gets into some of the money beliefs that we've talked about. And I think that's how I learned about Denise Duffield Thomas, from her. Right. The other two things I would recommend, these are older titles. It might be a little bit hard to find, but Creating True Prosperity by Shakti Gawain. That's a wonderful, kind of a little bit more on the spiritual, psychological side. And then another book called Prosperity Pie, How to Relax About Money and Everything Else by Sark, also known as Susan Ariel Rainbow Kennedy, one of my mentors. And that's a fantastic, very playful book about money.
Oh, fantastic. Lovely. Oh, well, thank you so much for chatting to us about this, because I know it's as I said at the top of the show, it can be quite an emotional subject for people. So having someone like yourself come in and talk about it in a very kind of practical, objective way, and just talk about some of these things that we all encounter, is really helpful. So thank you for that.
Thank you. And I just love having a money partner, someone in the writing world to play with some of these ideas with. So really appreciative.
Yeah, me too. But we mustn't forget to ask you about your writing, because summer's coming up. You've got your window of opportunity. What are you working on at the moment? And any exciting news for us about your writing?
I am working on, so I did this, I'm really passionate about getting people to submit their work. And so I ran a submission challenge, and then I have an online course called Chart Your Path to Publication. And I'm writing a short nonfiction book. So I'm working on that right now. But my main thing that I'm trying to advance is I have a contract with Falstaff Books for a horror novel. And so I am on the make sense draft, Emma, of that. And so hopefully that will be out by the end of this year. And I don't want to say too much more about it, but it's a horror novel. And a lot of my work has elements of psychological horror. I can tell you that it will take place in the Great Dismal Swamp, which is one of the largest swamps in the States, and that is between North Carolina and Virginia, which was on the path of the Underground Railroad, and just a lot of really interesting history in that area. So that's where it will take place, which I'm very excited about.
Yeah, so a possible release this year. That is exciting. Yes. Yay. And so for our listeners who'd be interested in learning more about you and what you do, where is the best place for them to do that?
Yeah, thank you. They should come out and hop over to my blog, the Practice of Creativity, and they'll see some information about how to get on my newsletter, which really is trying to support writers during the pandemic. And I'll send you a link to if people want to just kind of see that work. And also they can find me on Twitter, Michele, 1L, Michelet, Berger, Berger. I like to play there. And I would love to find ways to see if I can support you in my writers community, and we can keep talking about these really important issues.
Mm-hmm. Fantastic. Well, we'll link to those in the show notes, not a problem. Michele, as always, a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Emma. It's great.
If you're a first-time novelist who is struggling to either finish your novel or get those revisions to where you want them to be, then I've got just the thing for you. I have a small group coaching program which runs over 12 months, and over the course of that program I will help you fix those plot problems that you've been struggling with. I'll help you get under the surface of your characters so you really get to know them and what's driving them. And crucially for you, I give you that self-belief that you need to get you through the roller coaster that is writing a novel, so that you can carry on, get to the end, and get your book, your story out into the world so it can change people's lives. If that sounds good to you, if that is something that you'd be interested in doing, I know I can help you get to where you want to be. So book a call with me. Let's have a chat and see if we are a good fit for each other. If you're interested in doing that, then go to emmadesi.com/story builder. I look forward to chatting. Well, thank you so much for joining me today. I hope you found that helpful and inspirational. Now, don't forget to come on over to Facebook and join my group, Turning Readers into Writers. It is especially for you if you are a beginner writer who is looking to write their first novel. If you join the group, you will also find a free cheat sheet there called 3 Secret Hacks to Write with Consistency. So go to emmadesi.com/turning readers into writers. Hit join. Can't wait to see you in there. All right. Thank you. Bye-bye.